to a league insider who speculates on what he's heard about Harbaugh's prerequisites to even be interested in your job.
Okay.
$20 million a year.
Not a problem.
Not a problem. $10 million assistant coach budget.
Not a problem.
Okay. Total authority over the roster. And also would like to select his own guy to lean on, personnel guy.
Okay, so would he be making the draft picks? Like, you're going to ask this guy? That kind of makes me feel uneasy. Does he want more say over the roster than what he had in Baltimore?
Yes. Yes.
Ooh.
Which would be a total change in the structure here. I think there are 4 definite candidates for Harbaugh to end up with. Cleveland now is, I think, 4th.
Okay.
Miami.
The Giants.
Giants and
there was some improvement there. And, I sit here and I get ripped left and right. I read this all the time where I say, he makes you relevant. Guess what? People talk about the Cleveland Browns because Shedeur Sanders is on the team, regardless of whatever he does on the field. That is a fact. And that is a fact when you have a high-profile quarterback that has millions of followers on social media, that people are interested. Guess what? At the end of the day, this is an entertainment business. At the end of the day, it's about entertainment, and it's about teams making money. Hate to say that's the truth, but it is. We sit here as fans, and we want to believe that we're in la-la land, trying to understand that, he earns this or he deserved this. Nothing's given. You know that. LeBron taught you that, didn't he? So, again, I walk into next season wondering what the next head coach is going to do, or how he is going to lead Shedeur Sanders or any other quarterback that he may have.
Browns insider Tony Grossi just put something out there that has the entire NFL media world spinning right now. And I need y'all to understand what's actually being said here, because this isn't just about John Harbaugh potentially leaving Baltimore. This is about what it would take to get one of the most respected coaches in football to even consider coaching Shedeur Sanders in Cleveland, and the prerequisites that were just revealed are absolutely wild. We're talking $20 million a year, $10 million assistant coach budget, and here's the big one: total authority over the roster. Not input, not collaboration, authority. And on top of that, he wants to handpick his own personnel guy to lean on for roster decisions. So let me ask y'all this: does that sound like a coach who's just looking for a new job, or does that sound like a coach who's saying, if I'm doing this, we're doing it my way, no exceptions? Because let's be real, the Cleveland Browns have not structured their organization that way in decades. They've had the front office making decisions, the analytics department having major say, and coaches operating within that framework. And now we're hearing that Harbaugh, if he were to consider Cleveland, would want complete control. That's a massive shift. That's not just hearing a new coach, that's restructuring the entire power dynamic of the organization. And here's where it gets interesting. Tony Grossi mentioned that Cleveland is currently 4th on the list of teams Harbaugh might be interested in. 4th, behind Miami, the Giants, and Atlanta. So Cleveland isn't even at the top of his list, but the conversation is happening. The speculation is real, and the connection to Shedeur Sanders is what's making this entire discussion blow up. Now, before we go any further, let's establish the timeline here, because this matters. Shedeur Sanders just finished his college career at Colorado. The draft is approaching. Cleveland has the positioning to potentially select him. And simultaneously, there are questions about who's going to be coaching this team moving forward. We've seen instability. We've seen coaching changes. We've seen different schemes, different philosophies, different approaches that haven't worked. Now the possibility of bringing in someone like John Harbaugh, who has a proven track record with developing a quarterback like Lamar Jackson, and pairing him with Shedeur Sanders, that's the kind of move that changes a franchise overnight. But here's the uncomfortable part. The prerequisites that Harbaugh is reportedly asking for suggest that he doesn't trust the current structure. He doesn't want to walk into a situation where he's coaching but someone else is making roster decisions. He wants full control, and that raises a question. What does that say about how he views the Cleveland Browns organization as it currently exists? Let's talk about what Tony Grossi actually said, because this is important. He mentioned that these are prerequisites to even be interested in the job, not prerequisites to accept, prerequisites to be interested. That means before Harbaugh even considers Cleveland seriously, these conditions need to be on the table. $20 million a year, that's elite money, but it's not unreasonable for a coach of his caliber. $10 million assistant budget. That's significant, but again, if you want to build a championship staff, you need to pay for it. But total authority over the roster, that's where it gets complicated. Because that's essentially asking the Browns to hand over personnel control to someone who hasn't been with the organization, someone who would be coming in from a rival team, and trusting him to rebuild everything from the ground up. And the question Grossi raised is valid: would Harbaugh be making the draft picks? Would he have more say than he had in Baltimore? Because if the answer is yes, that's a complete restructuring of how the Browns operate. And here's where the Shedeur Sanders connection becomes critical. Another Browns insider, and I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but y'all heard what he said. He straight up told the truth about why people are even talking about the Cleveland Browns right now. He said Shedeur Sanders makes you relevant. Regardless of what he does on the field, the fact that he's a high-profile quarterback with millions of followers on social media means people are interested. And he's right. Let's keep it a buck. How many of y'all were talking about the Cleveland Browns before Shedeur's name got attached to them in mock drafts? How many of y'all were watching every move this franchise made? But now it's national conversation, now it's debate shows, now it's YouTube channels breaking down every angle. That's what a player like Shedeur brings, and that insider acknowledged it. He said at the end of the day, this is an entertainment business. It's about teams making money, it's about eyeballs. It's about relevance, and Shedeur Sanders, whether people want to admit it or not, brings all of that. But here's what makes this even more interesting. That same insider mentioned LeBron James. He said LeBron taught Cleveland fans that nothing's given, everything's earned. And that's facts. Cleveland fans know what it's like to have a superstar, to have someone who changes the entire trajectory of a franchise, and then to see them leave because the organization couldn't build around them properly. So when we talk about bringing in Shedeur Sanders and potentially pairing him with a coach like John Harbaugh, the stakes are incredibly high. Because if this doesn't work, if the structure isn't right, if the roster decisions aren't right, Cleveland could be looking at another decade of mediocrity. But if it does work, if Harbaugh gets the control he's asking for, if he's able to build around Shedeur the way he built around Lamar, we could be looking at a complete turnaround. Now let's talk about what Harbaugh actually did with Lamar Jackson, because this is the blueprint everyone keeps pointing to. When Lamar was drafted, there were questions. People doubted whether he could be a traditional pocket passer. People questioned his accuracy. People said he was a running back playing quarterback. And what did Harbaugh do? He didn't try to force Lamar into a system that didn't fit him. He built the system around Lamar's strengths. He adjusted the offense. He brought in the right personnel. He protected him early. And now Lamar Jackson is a two-time MVP. He's one of the most dynamic quarterbacks in the league, and the blueprint is there. So when people talk about Harbaugh coaching Shedeur, they're not just talking about a big-name coach. They're talking about someone who has proven he can develop a young quarterback and tailor an entire offense to maximize their skill set. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets uncomfortable: if Harbaugh is asking for total roster control. What does that say about his confidence in working within Cleveland's current structure? Does he believe the front office would make the right moves? Does he trust the analytics department to build a roster that fits Shedeur? Or is he saying, I've seen how this goes, I've been in the league long enough to know that if I don't have control, this won't work? Because that's a strong statement. That's not a coach just asking for a raise or a bigger office. That's a coach saying, if I'm doing this, I need to control every aspect of it, from the draft picks to the free agent signings to the coaching staff. And that level of control is rare in the NFL. Most teams don't operate that way. Most teams have a general manager, a front office, a scouting department, and the coach works within that framework. But Harbaugh is reportedly asking for something different. And let's be real, Cleveland has been struggling for decades. Tony Grossi mentioned it. 3-4 decades of the Browns not doing anything significant, no playoff success, constant coaching changes, quarterbacks coming and going. It's been a revolving door, so the argument could be made that maybe it's time to try something completely different. Maybe it's time to hand the keys to someone who's proven they know how to build a winning culture and let them do it their way. Because what Cleveland has been doing hasn't worked. The structure they've had in place hasn't produced results. So why not bring in someone like Harbaugh, give him the control he's asking for, and see if he can turn this thing around? But that's a massive gamble. That's asking ownership to essentially admit that the way they've been operating hasn't worked and to trust an outsider completely. Now let's talk about the fan reaction to all of this, because this is where it gets really interesting. Cleveland fans are passionate, they're loyal, they've stuck with this team through decades of disappointment. And now there's this possibility, this hope that maybe things could actually change. Maybe Shedeur Sanders is the answer at quarterback. Maybe John Harbaugh is the answer at head coach. And maybe, just maybe, this could be the combination that finally gets Cleveland back to relevance. But there's also fear, there's anxiety. Because Cleveland fans have been burned before. They've seen promising situations fall apart. They've seen high draft picks not pan out. They've seen coaching hires that look great on paper turn into disasters. So when you hear about Harbaugh's prerequisites, when you hear about the level of control he's asking for, there's a part of the fan base that's excited, but there's also a part that's nervous. Because if this doesn't work, if they give Harbaugh everything he's asking for and it still doesn't pan out, what then? And let's talk about Shedeur in all of this, because he's at the center of this entire discussion. From what we've seen at Colorado, Shedeur has shown composure. He's shown toughness. He's played behind offensive lines that haven't always protected him well, and he's still made plays. He's shown leadership. He's shown the ability to handle pressure, both on the field and off the field, with all the media attention that comes with being Sanders' son. But he's also coming into a situation in Cleveland that would be incredibly challenging. The offensive line has been a question mark. The weapons around him would need to be upgraded. The defense has had its struggles. So even with a coach like Harbaugh, even with the right structure, Shedeur would be walking into a rebuild. And the question is he ready for that? Is he the type of quarterback who can handle being the face of a franchise that's desperate for success? Because let's be real, the pressure on Shedeur in Cleveland would be immense. It's not just about playing well. It's not just about winning games. It's about changing the entire narrative of a franchise that's been stuck in mediocrity for decades. It's about living up to the hype. It's about justifying the control that Harbaugh would be asking for to build around him. It's about being the reason people are talking about the Cleveland Browns. And that insider was right when he said Shedeur makes Cleveland relevant regardless of what he does on the field. But eventually, what he does on the field has to match the attention. Eventually, the wins have to come. Eventually, the playoffs have to happen. And if they don't, the same fans who are excited right now will turn. That's just the reality of sports. That's the reality of being a high-profile quarterback in a market that's desperate for success. Now let's talk about the other teams that are reportedly higher on Harbaugh's list because this matters. Miami was mentioned. The Giants were mentioned. Atlanta was mentioned. So what do those teams have that Cleveland doesn't? Well, Miami has a warmer climate, a more stable front office, and weapons on offense. The Giants have the New York market, a historic franchise, and ownership that's willing to spend. Atlanta has a young core, a solid defense, and a situation that might be closer to competing immediately. So Cleveland is competing against markets and situations that on paper might look more attractive. But here's the counterpoint: none of those teams have Shedeur Sanders. None of those teams have the potential to pair Harbaugh with a young quarterback who could be the face of the franchise for the next decade. So maybe that's the selling point. Maybe that's what moves Cleveland up the list. Maybe the opportunity to coach Shedeur, to build something from scratch with complete control, is what makes this situation more appealing than the others. But let's not ignore the uncomfortable truth here, which is that if Harbaugh is asking for this level of control, it suggests he doesn't believe he can win without it. It suggests that he's seen situations where coaches don't have roster control and it limits what they can do. And maybe he's right. Maybe the only way to turn around a franchise like Cleveland is to have one person at the top making all the decisions, ensuring that everything from the draft to free agency to coaching philosophy is aligned. But that's also a lot of pressure on one person. If Harbaugh gets everything he's asking for and it doesn't work, there's no one else to blame. It's on him. And that's a level of accountability that not every coach is willing to accept. And let's talk about the money for a second, because $20 million a year is significant. That would make Harbaugh one of the highest paid coaches in the NFL. And the $10 million assistant budget is also notable, because that suggests he wants to bring in elite coordinators, elite position coaches, people who can help execute his vision. But here's the question: is Cleveland willing to spend that kind of money? Are they willing to invest at that level? Because if they're not, this conversation is pointless. If ownership isn't willing to meet Harbaugh's financial demands, then he's not coming to Cleveland and we're back to square one. But if they are willing to spend, if they're willing to make that kind of investment, it signals that they're serious about turning this thing around. It signals that they're not just looking for a quick fix, they're looking for a long-term solution. Now let's circle back to what that insider said about entertainment and business, because I think this is where a lot of fans get uncomfortable, but it's the truth. The NFL is a business. Teams make decisions based on revenue, based on ratings, based on merchandise sales, based on fan engagement. And Shedeur Sanders, whether people want to admit it or not, drives all of those things. He has millions of followers on social media. He has name recognition. He has a father who's one of the most famous athletes in the world. And when you put all of that together, Shedeur brings attention. He brings eyeballs, he brings conversation, and in a league where attention equals money, that matters. So when Cleveland is making a decision about who to draft, it's not just about whether Shedeur can play quarterback at a high level, it's also about what he brings off the field. It's about whether he can make Cleveland relevant again. And based on everything we've seen, he can. But here's where the balance comes in, because while attention and relevance are important, they don't win games. Followers on social media don't translate to touchdowns. Name recognition doesn't fix an offensive line. So yes, Shedeur brings all of those intangible benefits, but at the end of the day, he has to be able to play. He has to be able to execute in the NFL. He has to be able to handle the speed, the complexity, the physicality of the professional game. And that's where having a coach like Harbaugh becomes so critical. Because Harbaugh has shown he can take a young quarterback with questions and turn them into a superstar. He did it with Lamar, and the belief is that he could do it with Shedeur, but only if he has the control to build the right situation around him. And let's talk about the development aspect, because this is something that doesn't get talked about enough. When you draft a young quarterback, especially one who's going to be the face of the franchise, how you develop them in those first few years is critical. Do you throw them into the fire immediately, or do you let them sit and learn? Do you surround them with veteran weapons, or do you try to build through the draft? Do you scheme to their strengths, or do you try to fit them into your system? These are all decisions that have long-term implications. And if Harbaugh has total roster control, he's the one making all of those decisions. He's the one deciding whether Shedeur starts right away or sits behind a veteran. He's the one deciding which weapons to bring in. He's the one deciding what the offensive scheme looks like. And that level of alignment, where the coach and the GM are essentially the same person, could be exactly what a young quarterback needs to succeed. But let's also acknowledge the risk here, because not every coach who gets total control succeeds. We've seen coaches get personnel power and make bad draft picks. We've seen coaches build rosters that don't work. We've seen situations where giving one person too much control leads to disaster. So this isn't a guaranteed formula for success. This is a gamble. And Cleveland fans have to be okay with that. They have to be okay with the possibility that this doesn't work. But they also have to recognize that doing the same thing they've been doing for the past 3 decades hasn't worked either. So maybe it's time to take a risk. Maybe it's time to try something different. Maybe it's time to give someone like Harbaugh the keys and see what he can do. Now let's talk about the media cycle around all of this, because it's been fascinating to watch. You have insiders like Tony Grossi putting out information about Harbaugh's prerequisites. You have other insiders talking about Shedeur's impact on Cleveland's relevance. You have fans debating on social media. You have analysts breaking down whether this pairing makes sense. And all of this is happening before any official decisions have been made. Shedeur hasn't been drafted yet. Harbaugh hasn't left Baltimore yet. Cleveland hasn't made any coaching changes yet. But the conversation is happening, the speculation is real, and that in itself shows the power of this potential pairing, because people are interested, people are paying attention, and that's exactly what Cleveland needs. But let's also be real about the challenges Shedeur would face in Cleveland, because they're significant. The AFC North is one of the toughest divisions in football. You've got Baltimore with Lamar Jackson. You've got Cincinnati with Joe Burrow. You've got Pittsburgh with a strong defense and a winning culture. So Shedeur wouldn't just be trying to turn around a struggling franchise, he'd be trying to compete in a division with multiple playoff caliber teams. And that's not easy. That's not something that happens overnight. Even with a coach like Harbaugh, even with total roster control, it would take time to build a team that can compete at that level. So the question becomes, how much patience do Cleveland fans have? How much time are they willing to give this situation to develop? Because if they're expecting immediate results, they're going to be disappointed. And let's talk about Shedeur's skill set for a second, because there are things he does really well and things that are questions. From what we've seen at Colorado, he's got quick decision-making. He's accurate on short and intermediate throws. He's got good pocket presence. He's tough. He doesn't get rattled easily. But there are also questions about his arm strength on deep balls. There are questions about how he'll handle NFL-level pass rushes. There are questions about whether he can elevate the players around him the way elite quarterbacks do. And these are all fair questions. These are things that scouts are looking at. These are things that teams are evaluating. But here's the thing, none of those questions are deal breakers. None of those things suggest he can't be successful in the NFL. They're just things that need to be developed, things that need to be coached up, things that a coach like Harbaugh would be responsible for improving. And that's why this pairing makes so much sense on paper, because Harbaugh has shown he can take a quarterback with questions and maximize their potential. He did it with Lamar, who had major questions coming out of Louisville. People said Lamar couldn't throw. People said he was just a runner. People said he'd never succeed as a traditional quarterback, and Harbaugh proved all of them wrong. So the belief is that he could do the same with Shedeur. He could build an offense that plays to Shedeur's strengths. He could protect him with the right offensive line. He could surround him with weapons. He could develop him into a franchise quarterback, but again, only if he has the control to make all of those decisions. Now let's talk about what this means for Cleveland's current structure, because if they agree to Harbaugh's prerequisites, it would require significant changes. You'd potentially be looking at a new general manager, or at least someone who reports to Harbaugh. You'd be looking at a new scouting department philosophy. You'd be looking at a new approach to free agency and the draft. You'd essentially be blowing up the current system and starting over. And that's scary for an organization. That's asking ownership to admit that what they've been doing hasn't worked and to trust someone else completely. But maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Maybe Cleveland needs to stop trying to tinker around the edges and commit to a complete overhaul. Maybe they need to go all in on this partnership between Harbaugh and Shedeur and see where it leads. But let's not pretend this is going to be easy, because it won't be. Building a championship team takes time. It takes the right draft picks. It takes hitting on free agents. It takes player development. It takes chemistry. It takes health. It takes luck. And even with the best coach and the best quarterback, things can still go wrong. But the alternative is continuing down the same path Cleveland has been on, and that clearly hasn't worked. So maybe the risk is worth it. Maybe the potential reward of finally turning this franchise around is worth the gamble of giving one person total control. And let's talk about the timeline of all this, because it matters. If Cleveland is going to make a move for Harbaugh, it needs to happen soon. If they're going to draft Shedeur, that decision is coming up. These aren't things that can be dragged out indefinitely. There's a window here, and Cleveland needs to decide if they're going to jump through it or let the opportunity pass. Because if Harbaugh goes to Miami or New York or Atlanta, that chance is gone. If another team drafts Shedeur, that chance is gone. So the pressure is on Cleveland's front office to make a decision, and to make the right decision because the stakes couldn't be higher. Now let's bring it back to what that insider said about relevance, because I think it's the most important point in all of this. He said people talk about the Cleveland Browns because Shedeur Sanders is on the team regardless of what he does on the field. And that's powerful. That's the kind of impact that very few players have. That's the kind of attention that can change a franchise's trajectory. Because when people are talking, when people are watching, when people are engaged, that creates momentum. That creates opportunities. That creates a culture of expectation. And Cleveland hasn't had that in a long time. They've been an afterthought. They've been a punchline. They've been the team people forget about. But Shedeur changes that immediately. Just by being there, just by being the quarterback, he makes Cleveland relevant again. But here's the uncomfortable question that needs to be asked. What happens if it doesn't work? What happens if Harbaugh gets total control, if Shedeur gets drafted, if all the pieces fall into place and it still doesn't lead to success? What happens if the offensive line still struggles? What happens if the defense still can't stop anyone? What happens if Shedeur takes time to develop and the wins don't come right away? Because that's a real possibility. That's something Cleveland fans need to be prepared for, because the attention Shedeur brings is a double-edged sword. When things are going well, it's amazing. When things are struggling, every mistake gets magnified, every loss gets dissected, every question gets amplified. So Cleveland would be signing up for intense scrutiny, intense pressure, and intense expectations. And not every organization can handle that. And let's be real about what Harbaugh would be walking into if he takes this job. He'd be leaving a situation in Baltimore where he's established, where he's respected, where he's built a winning culture, to go to a team that's been one of the least successful franchises in the NFL over the past few decades. That's not an easy decision. That's not something you do unless you believe you can really turn it around. And the fact that he's reportedly asking for total control suggests he knows how big of a challenge it would be. He knows that to succeed in Cleveland, he needs to be able to make every decision. He needs to be able to build the roster his way. He needs to be able to implement his system without interference. And if Cleveland's not willing to give him that, then he's better off staying in Baltimore or going to one of the other teams on his list. So where does this leave us? We've got a Browns insider revealing that Harbaugh wants $20 million a year, a $10 million assistant budget, and total roster control. We've got another insider saying that Shedeur makes Cleveland relevant just by being there. We've got a potential pairing that could change the entire trajectory of a franchise. But we've also got questions. We've got uncertainty. We've got a situation where nothing is confirmed, nothing is official, and everything is still speculation. And that's where this story sits right now. In this uncomfortable space where the possibility is exciting but the reality is unclear, where the potential is massive but the risk is significant, where Cleveland fans want to believe but are afraid to hope. Because at the end of the day, this is about more than just football. This is about a city that's been waiting for decades to have a championship team. This is about fans who have stuck with this franchise through the worst of times. This is about whether Cleveland is willing to do whatever it takes to finally turn this thing around. And if that means giving John Harbaugh total control, if that means drafting Shedeur Sanders and building around him, if that means completely restructuring the organization, then maybe that's what needs to happen. But it's a decision that can't be made lightly. It's a decision that will define this franchise for the next decade. And Cleveland's front office knows that. The pressure is on them, the spotlight is on them, and everyone's watching to see what they do next.